Thank you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is great to be back in London for Fortune Brainstorm AI. As I look around this room, I see the brilliant minds who are building, funding, regulating, and challenging what AI can and should become. Last year, we talked about AI starting to understand and generate images, language, and voice. Now the next frontier is here: reasoning, planning, acting. It's already starting to happen. The question is, are we ready to build with this new capability, to scale it responsibly, to regulate it in ways that protect people without slowing progress? Over the next 2 days, you'll hear from leaders, entrepreneurs, policymakers, and technologists. We'll explore AI agents, productivity gains, scaling pilots into products, and the policies shaping what happens next. We'll ask what it means to trust AI, power it sustainably, and use it wisely. We have a stellar lineup of speakers, but remember, a Fortune Brainstorm is built for discussion. It is a brainstorm after all. So the most important conversations are the ones that you have among each other. Our audience, all of you, reflects an array of industries and an even broader range of voices. Together, the companies in this room represent several $1 trillion in value, from Amazon and Google to MasterCard and Ford. And those are just the publicly traded ones. But it's not about the money. It's about the influence. The decisions you're making now shape how millions of people live, work, and dream. So if you haven't already, download the Fortune Events app for this week's agenda, as well as a way to connect with each other. If something strikes you over the next couple of days, please share it using the hashtag FortuneAILondon. One word. Before we start, a few acknowledgments. To my co-chairs, Jeremy Kahn, Ali Garfinkel, and Jason Del Rey, thank you for your incredible work. I also want to thank the entire Fortune Live Media team, production, programming, marketing, sales. Without it, this couldn't happen. So please, a round of applause for the Fortune team. It also gives me great pleasure to say that we're going to be joined this week by the editorial director of Fortune Most Powerful Women, my colleague Ellie Austin, here on her home turf. So a round of applause for her, please. What a treat. And of course, a massive, massive thank you to our founding partner, Accenture, for making this event possible. One more round of applause, if you don't mind. So, one last reminder before we get started. What's said on this main stage in our strategy sessions is on the record, unless otherwise noted. What's said over break or over dinner is private. Now, without further ado, please welcome my colleague, Fortune AI editor, Jeremy Kahn, for our first conversation.
Hey, everybody. Well, here in the UK, Lord Holmes and Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who will be joining us on stage in a moment, have both introduced separate artificial intelligence regulation bills. Meanwhile, the government is implementing an AI Opportunities Action Plan. In the EU, legislation is now coming into force. And across the Atlantic, well, let's just say things are evolving. We're going to dig into the UK's quote-unquote pro-innovation approach to AI regulation. We're going to look at whether there's a chance for international alignment on AI policy and what it takes to craft good rules for a fast-moving technology. Our panel today brings together both legislators and the legislated. Please welcome to the stage Lord Tim Clement-Jones CBE, member of the House of Lords, Lord Holmes of Richmond, MBE, peer in the House of Lords, Betsabeh Madani-Hermann, Global Head of Research at Philips, and Navrina Singh, founder and CEO of Credo AI. Please give them a round of applause. Well, First, I want to start out by teasing apart something that you often hear, which is that the idea that regulation and innovation are in opposition to one another. Do you think that's really true? Tim, what do you think on this about this topic?
Well, it's one of my mantras, actually, that regulation is not the enemy of innovation, because I actually believe that if you regulate properly and appropriately, proportionately, in a way that is, in a sense, agreed with business, you're going to have certainty there. You're going to have clarity. You're going to have the ability to innovate, knowing what the future of regulation is. It's very important for business to know the framework within which they're expected to govern AI.
Sure. But Betsabeh, you're in industry. Do you agree with that?
I work in healthcare, so I think for us, patient safety is at the center and the core of everything we do, which means regulations are actually helpful for those patient safety. I mean, we abide by FDA, we abide by the EU regulations all the time. So AI is only another feature that's being added in.
Interesting. And the other thing I want to ask is whether we really need new regulations or whether the existing regulations is sufficient. Chris, you've introduced a new AI bill. Why do you feel that's necessary? Why is the existing law not sufficient to cover this technology?
Well, as already mentioned, there's a false dichotomy which has dogged us for decades in pretty much all democracies, this sense that you can either have regulation or innovation. Complete nonsense, because if you have right-sized regulation, it's good for innovator, good for investor, good for citizen, good for consumer. So what my bill seeks to do is to ensure that whichever part of society, whichever part of the economy you come across AI, you can have that consistency of approach. You can have that certainty of how AI will be that in healthcare, defense, education. So if you just left it to existing regulation, the chances of having that clarity, certainty, consistency, which leads to the confidence to act, would be extremely unlikely.
Tim, do you agree, or do we, are the existing laws adaptable to this technology, or do we really need new law?
No, we do need new law. I mean, the idea that we've got enough kind of sectoral coverage of this, A, is wrong because there are many sectors that aren't going to be covered by a regulator, and B, there are things like transparency, accountability, clear liability are not there in our current laws. And all our current government in the UK is planning to do is to have some sort of incorporation of what we call the Bletchley Declaration applying to generative AI. Well, there are many other forms of AI which need regulation.
Interesting. Chris, I wanted to ask you, there's a sense out there this is a very new technology, a very nascent technology, and that it might be premature to be regulating it, that we might get it wrong. And people sometimes point to how the UK, I guess, initially regulated automotive traffic. They had these red flag laws. People had to, walk in front of automobiles waving a red flag to try to warn pedestrians that an automobile was coming. And this, of course, seems silly now. Are we in, is there a risk that we're going to end up in the sort of same place with AI? Do you think that there's a risk that, this is too nascent a technology to really be able to regulate appropriately, Chris?
I think if I was driving a car, everybody in this audience would be happy for someone with a red flag to be, or a yellow flag or a green flag. In fact, maybe all three. But no, the fundamental point is, if you take an overly prescriptive approach and try and snapshot this moment in time and cover all in nailed down regulation legislation, that will be problematic. But if you take a principles-based, outcomes-focused, inputs understood approach, that gives you the best chance for having legislation and regulation which can speak to this moment in time, but is agile, adaptive, flexible. And what we have in the UK is the great good fortune of English common law, which is exactly that: adaptable, flexible, agile. Not only that, it brings a certainty because it's respected right around the world and has been understood for centuries and is used in countries which have no connection to the UK because of that stability and certainty that English common law brings.
Now, in the EU, they don't have the same common law tradition, and they already have an EU AI Act out there. I want to go to Navrina. You're helping some companies comply with this act, which is now in force. What's your view of the EU AI Act, and has it gotten the balance right here in terms of regulation? And are there lessons there that could be adapted either in the UK or other geographies?
I don't think any regulation and policy right now is getting it right. Having said that, I do want to underscore, I think we need to be in a very adaptive policy-making arena because, one, AI capabilities are transforming so quickly. So if you have a policy and regulation that's very stringent, it's going to be out of order the next day. So when we think about EU AI Act, I think there are certain common ground principles, which is just good hygiene, Jeremy, around AI registry, risk management. I think those are good hygiene practices to have. But in terms of does it serve the needs of context-based use cases? Absolutely not.
Betsabeh, what's your view at Philips of the EU AI Act?
So, as I mentioned earlier, because of healthcare as an industry being highly regulated in itself, for us, we think about the AI rules that are being placed, and they are divergent across the world. Not adding to the confusion would be the right way of looking at it. So complexity is totally fine. Divergent views are absolutely fine. It brings integrative complexity to the discussions. It brings different peoples with different views. You can be more comprehensive. But what's really important is the rules and regulations that are put in place need to help the entire ecosystem. So if you have only large tech companies being able to abide by rules because they're so stringent, then you shut down a piece of the ecosystem, the startups that may not be able to put in every single one of those key checkpoints in place. So that agility that I think was mentioned by Chris is really important. I agree with you. I think there's a lot of nuances that may need to be still considered all around the world.
And do you think that agility is sort of not there in the EU AI Act, that it's maybe too hard for a small company to check all those boxes?
So I think because of different regions having their own requirements and having their own nuances around how they see the regulations embed, what EU sets likely works for the EU. But if a company is global, that's where the agility comes in. And I think for us, when we innovate, we put regulators, innovators, so engineers, clinicians, all in the same room. We talk about it from the beginning, so we don't end up building in silos without considering all of the nuances that come in. Patient safety and patient care is at the core of our mission. Now, it's different for other industries that may not be as highly regulated in their own way. So I think that would be a different question for those audiences. But for us, when it comes to patient safety, I think that's where the North Star is, and that's where we keep our heads toward.
Interesting. And I know you're in the medical and healthcare space. A lot of the AI medical sort of devices that have come in have gotten FDA approval under this 510K process, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a somewhat accelerated way a device can get approval by showing it sort of provides equivalent standard of care to an existing approved device. Do you think that that's the right process by which we should be having sort of AI brought into healthcare, or I think there's some people out there who feel that we really should be conducting clinical testing of each device to say, does it actually improve patient care, not just is it equivalent to some existing device? What's your kind of view on the 510K process and the fact that that seems to be the primary method by which things have been regulated so far in healthcare?
For us, in conversations we've had with the regulators, we actually see they are also looking at how they should innovate themselves. So in the conversation I've had, for example, with a couple of folks from the FDA recently, they also talk about how they are not necessarily looking at applying the rules of the past to the future because they're also keeping up. I think the world has shifted away from we'll go lock ourselves in a room, come up with new regulations, and let you guys know in 6 years from now, because everything else must have moved forward. The regulators are working closely, and so with the innovators, the same as we pull them in the room, they're also willing. For us, we're taking every product, one product at a time, not necessarily looking at what has been before and what's now. We have we're working with FDA closely on and with our partners closely on clinical data insights. So how do you actually get clinical data of the patient, give physicians more insights faster so they can make decisions faster? At the end of the day, all of the work that we're doing is focused on giving back time to the clinician, making the care more precise and more accessible all around the world. And I think technology is a big part of that.
Got it. And Navrina, you have this dilemma. The regulators, to some extent, have a dilemma of trying to set rules for a very fast-moving, quickly evolving technology. That's also a problem for corporate governance. You're working inside companies to help them create governance procedures and comply with various rules. How is it looking sort of from inside business?
You know, it's interesting because something that Tim said in the beginning is really important, that we are seeing governance actually enable sustainable AI innovation. So the companies that have the right hygiene around risk management, they are seeing less failures of their Gen AI systems in production. Just a stat for everybody, 60% of Gen AI applications actually are failing in production if they don't have governance. So when you think about, the enterprises we serve at Credo AI, and just for everybody, Credo AI helps you not only find risk in AI, mitigate that risk, but also get you to compliance with AI regulations and standards. We are finding that organizations who are putting a lot of thought in governance practices are able to innovate faster. They're able to adopt AI faster. So they're seeing the top line growth. They're able to sell more faster. They're able to build stakeholder trust, which, as you know, is going to be critical to making sure AI ROI is actually realized.
Absolutely. I'm going to go for questions from the audience shortly, so please think of your questions, and we'll hopefully get a few in for the panel. Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on the corporate governance point. Navrina's absolutely right. You should start now, basically, and create that certainty for both adoption and development within your corporate. But there's plenty to draw on. There are those international standards already. ISO 42001 is something that a lot of corporations are adopting. And that, to me, it's both a risk assessment and it's to do with management of the adoption of AI. Now, that is becoming quite common currency. So it's not as if we're, writing on a blank canvas, basically.
Yeah. Navrina, ISO 42001, I guess the issue there is it's a very procedural-based standard, right? It's like, do you have these policy around these things, check the box? How do you bring it beyond sort of checking the box to actually something that's operationalized?
Yeah, we say this at Credo AI, that if you're just trying to check the box, you're already a loser in AI race. So just FYI, ISO 42001, though the intention is great, it unfortunately is not able to, within the use case context, really figure out what's happening in your AI ops pipeline. And so as a result of which, this is where, I think there needs to be a much more multi-stakeholder coordinated effort around standards and benchmarks that are much more use case focused.
Yeah, it's not a technical standard. It's more of a procedural standard.
Exactly.
I want to get back to sort of what's happening in the UK. The government had this report, the UK AI Opportunities Action Plan, which was actually commissioned by the previous government, but they've said, the Prime Minister said he was going to mainline this report into the veins of government. I want to ask Chris, what's your view of that plan? What's your take on the Opportunities Action Plan?
It's a good plan. It's got 50 recommendations in it. They're all good recommendations. Matt Clifford did exactly what he was asked to do. The question then becomes, and what happens now? How does that become reality right across the UK? And there's quite a gap there, in the same way that before the last election, Labour were very keen on the principles and clauses in, for example, my AI regulation bill, when they came into office, less so. And in the last few months, even less up for legislating and regulating. So the plan of itself and the recommendations are in there, very good. But bringing this to life and having a cross-government, cross-economy, cross-society approach to really bring to life this sense that if we understand AI, not as just Gen AI, for example, which I fear that there's too much collapsing into that way of thinking, that that's what AI is. As most people in this room will know, it's a constellation of technologies, some yet to come into being. But if it's understood how they can be threaded through and understood in terms of the context of the extraordinary challenges that are now facing us, climate crisis, energy emergency, social mobility, migration, cost of living, etc., AI has something to say in there, but not of itself AI as human-led, human-in-the-loop technology, and wherever it's deployed, particularly in an automated way, humans having the right to a human, plainly, easily understandable explanation of exactly what's gone on there.
Right. I want to get some questions from the audience, so please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll get a paddle to you if you can then stand up and say who you are. Let's get a paddle to somebody just here. Great. If you could stand up and say who you are and then ask your question. Oh. If you, we can probably hear you. There we go.
I can speak pretty loudly.
That's
There we
it's
go.
on there.
Fascinating discussion. I'm Martha Beath from Fitch Group. I'm very curious. There-
Just keep, well, I can hear you here. I can repeat your question.
I think that this approach is helpful, or do you think that regulators will take more of a reactive role?
So yeah, the question is whether regulators should be proactive in trying to help companies figure out how they should apply some of these rules and apply AI, or should it be more of a reactive thing by regulators trying to sort of, or maybe negative regulation trying to say what you shouldn't do. Tim, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, the FCA actually invented sandboxing effectively, and I do think that is a really important way of de-risking AI development, because at least you are getting, if you like, an understanding of the framework from your own regulator. Now, it doesn't cover the full waterfront, it covers the financial services regulations, and that's where Chris and I absolutely agree that we need this cross-sectoral kind of regulation. But in terms of sectoral regulation, already sandboxing is used by the FCA, by the ICO, and by some of the other regulators. So yes, I do think they should be proactive.
Yeah, interesting. Other questions? There's one down here in front.
Thank you very much. Jack Aldane for Global Government Forum. Question is for both lords on the panel here. What specific guardrails currently absent would make you feel more confident than you are today about UK civil servants using generative AI and other AI tools like LLMs in their day-to-day roles?
Tim, I know your bill that was introduced was specifically about government use of AI. So maybe you can take that one first and then Chris.
To me, it's all about transparency, which is lacking. There is an algorithmic transparency recording standard, which the government say that they're introducing across government. It doesn't cover local government. It doesn't cover a register of algorithms used in government, and it doesn't provide mechanisms for complaints and redress for the ordinary citizen. And there have been many cases where the government's use of things like automated decision-making have been highly problematic, both in immigration areas and in social security. And that's what really worries me, that, we're walking into this in rather a complacent way. And that's why I put forward a private member's bill to really try and tighten up that use in the public sector.
And Chris, if you were a few guardrails you'd like to see put in place, what would they be?
But putting the human at the center of all this, which means enabling and empowering civil servants, officials to have the training, have the education, have the learning around these systems that they potentially can deploy for public benefit across all government departments. Again, principles-based, outcomes-focused, inputs understood. Briefly to those principles: trust and transparency, inclusion and innovation, interoperability, accountability, critical, assurance, and accessibility. If they have those principles threaded through the approach, then it really could have some positive benefits for the state. But as Tim has already identified, there's been examples where it's been, if you will, rushed at and grabbed at, and you've seen some very, very negative and unfortunate results. And if you have that, it makes that sense of public trust, understandably, even harder to start to come towards technologies. But the opportunities, in essence, for our public sector and our public services are extraordinary. But understanding we're only going to get this right if it is human-led, human in the loop, and human understanding of the decisions and what's going on there, which is
Right.
quite a big gig for the civil service, particularly just as a footnote. If you look what's now happening with digital ID, which is a slightly unfortunate development just lately.
Interesting. And I'm going to ask Navrina and Betsabeh, what are there specific things, a few things you'd like to see in terms of guardrails come from the public sector on this technology? Navrina, you go first.
I think we need, again, use case specific guardrails. So I agree with Tim around the principles, but the question is within a financial services fraud model compared to facial recognition.
So sectoral specific.
You need to be much more specific. So I would like to see that. And the second thing I would love to see is much more context-focused evaluations and benchmarks.
Got it. Betsabeh?
Speed and clarity more than anything else.
Great. I know there's one more question, at least from the audience. Go ahead. We'll try to fit one more in.
This is for more for.
Can you say you are?
Seth Dobrin from Quantum AI and One Infinity Ventures. Navrina, Betsabeh. So you both very familiar with the EU AI Act. What advice do you have for Lord Clement-Jones and Lord Richmond or Lord Holmes as they're crafting this legislation to avoid the mistakes and pitfalls that they've made in the EU?
Somewhat leading question.
I don't know if I can answer that.
Navrina, do you have any?
Do you want to start? You go ahead. I think there's two core things. Again, you can't have a peanut butter approach. I'm a big believer in context. So my recommendation would be focus on use case specific guardrails and regulations. And I think the second thing is there is a massive need for standardization and interoperability, which I have not seen happen at scale. So I would encourage thinking about how do you bring this very fragmented ecosystem together.
Right. Betsabeh?
I think focusing on what problem are you trying to solve. So last week I sat down with NHS with a couple of CEOs of hospitals. And for example, in some cases, putting the patients through 3 times faster through an MRI, it gets you a massive roadblock and a bottleneck out of the system, and it gives care to more people available. So focusing on what the regulations that are being put in place are trying to solve, I think is the number one important.
I want to ask a question on, before we run out of time, on the possibility of alignment internationally. And obviously, sort of the elephant in the room here is maybe what's happening in the US, and there's so much pressure coming from the Trump administration against countries around the world, and in Europe in particular, not to pass regulation that's going to be perceived as sort of beating up US tech companies. And I think it's probably held back the government here in the UK from introducing an AI bill that they've talked about when they were running for election, talked about bringing forward. Tim, what's your view about the way the UK should try to respond to this pressure from the US?
Well, I think what we've got to do is move further and faster towards international standards, because then it won't matter quite so much how you regulate by jurisdiction. I mean, we've heard criticism of the EU AI Act, and all of us think that it's probably overcomplicated and so on. But what they are actually doing in the conformity assessment is identifying a number of international standards which they will require to be installed as part of conforming to the AI Act. And, I mentioned ISO 42001 earlier, but there'll be other standards more akin to those produced by NIST, for instance, the risk assessment framework, and there'll be others along the way in terms of testing, training, and so on. Now, if we can, and the OECD is doing a lot of work on this, if we can agree on some of those international standards, we'll get the kind of interoperability that Chris was talking about, and that, I think, will be very significant.
Chris, do you feel like there is this chance to get alignment despite what the sort of rhetoric you're getting out of Washington?
There's a chance, and also to understand what's really happening in the United States. It's a mistake to just see the pronouncements from the White House, because if you look at a state level, for example, there's interesting things happening in a number of jurisdictions at that state level. And also, I think what the UK and other nations need to do is not get caught on thinking, as I said earlier, that AI is just Gen AI. Gen AI is one element of it, but when you look at the ecosystem of technologists, startups and scale-ups across the UK and other jurisdictions, there's a whole variety, a fabulous constellation of different technologies being brought to bear. So don't get fixated that Gen AI is the only show in town and you have to approach everything from that part of the US approach. Don't mistake and think that things that come from the White House is the beginning, middle, and end of what's happening with AI in the United States.
Great. And Navrina, before we run out of time, I mean, what's from inside companies that you're working with, do you feel like there is this chance for international alignment despite, quite a difference in rhetoric from different geographies?
Absolutely, but I think it's going to take some time. Great.
All right, we're out of time. Thank you very much, guys, for taking time to talk with us. And it's been a fascinating discussion. And thank you very much. Give everyone a round.